The mobile. I mean, mobile, in our experience, is the way that we have the more part of our news every day. Not only news, but is what we use in every time of our day. Do you think that the mainstream publishers are working the right way to use the mobile, or you see other operators? I mean, the biggest one that are working in a better way.
I think most mainstream publishers have done a good job with tablets because that's a transition audience.
Yeah, sure.
The feel and the
It's
experience
not
is similar.
so far from.
And the advertising sales opportunity is somewhat similar. You can say you take an ad in the paper, you take an ad in the tablet. Where we're all struggling, I think, and not recognizing that we need to do more is when it comes to phones. And we're also not creating interesting phone experiences with our journalism. There's no reason why Facebook's paper app is actually a pretty interesting, compelling experience that Facebook has created. And Circa, which is an independent venture, nothing to do with the big newsroom, there's not a single major big newsroom that has come out with a product we all go, oh, this is compelling. And I think that's the real problem. We are not able to kind of acknowledge it. And the pressure isn't there yet because everybody's struggling to make money. So there's no push from your ad department to do more with mobile yet. But it'll happen because audiences are moving in such a big way.
Malik, about Raju has told us something about the paywalls. A lot of publishers all around the world fought in the last 2 years that paywalls can be one of the ways to reach a new form of revenues. What do you think about everything, about what is going on in this part of the business, about paywalls? I mean.
So, from the perspective of paywalls, I have a very simple outlook. For the longest time, people have been used to getting a certain type of content for free. And if you put a paywall on that, that is just backward-looking move. It is not going to work. However, if you use your free audience, the people you have nurtured with free content, and make something compelling for them to buy, they will pay for it. We have tried it in our company, and it has worked. It has, in fact, saved us from being slaves to CPM-based advertising and doing crazy things like listicles and slideshows and whatnot, and cheapen our page views. But if you want to charge for what you have been giving away for free, that's not going to work. So you have to really take a step back and say, what is the creative, compelling experience we can create which is useful for our readers or our community? I don't even think of them as readers. I think of folks who support us as our community. What is it that they want? What is that is missing in their workflow which they would be willing to spend money on? And every company has a different need they can fulfill, right? Not everybody is going to will grow up to be New York Times or Wall Street Journal, but there are small, focused niches which you can fill by delivering content which is high value, high impact, and worth paying for. Now, this isn't going to be like $1 billion business on day one, but if you hit the right targets, it can be a big enough business that you can coexist your free business with, and this is a way to subsidize that free business.
How important is frictionless payments? Because between iPhone and between Apple, between Amazon, they have done it, but most publishers still struggle to kind of make it an easy experience to even if somebody wants to pay.
I will go a little bit, I'll say something which is not very friendly to the big publishers is,
okay.
The big publishers are always in the business of taking something from their readers, always. Give me, give me, give me. There is never this desire to give back. And that is why it is very hard for big companies and big publishers to come up with simple solutions like simple sign-on, simple payment systems. And it is because they want to say, I want to get all the information about you, so I can have all the data about you, so I can geo-target you, and I can sell you 50 things. No, let's start by saying, what can we do to make this customer happy? Like, just the very basic thing. Get up in the morning and just say, a happy reader is a reader which is going to come back and eventually might buy something, right? So that's the way we have to think about the payment systems. Also, it's like friction is not going to help us for that.
And the other big difference is that online you can develop a voice which appeals to a large group of people, maybe not in percentage terms, but certainly in number terms and in absolute terms. And when you have that voice, people want to give you money. There's this idea about paywalls that what you need to do, if you're Rupert Murdoch, is put up these very high paywalls and say, you know what, I'm not going to let you read my content unless you pay me money, and I'm going to worry about people reading my content and not paying me money, and that's going to be a bad thing, and I'm going to come at you with a stick and force you to pay me if you want to read my content. And I think a much more positive way of approaching it, which does work online, maybe not for a company the size of News Corp, but certainly for smaller companies, is to just create something which people really love. And if people really love you and follow you and love what you do, and then you turn around to them and say, hey, can I have some money for this? They're likely to say yes.
But has that been proven? I mean, you look at something like, well, there are several sites that have said, you can pay what you want, or we hope that you'll pay, and so on. And has it really actually worked? Not always. Several of them have failed because people aren't paying as much as they had hoped.
If the business model is charity,
yeah,
then you have to accept that that is the business model, and some people will pay and some won't. Right? A small percentage of people will be charitable enough to do that. It also causes all sorts of other interesting problems for for-profit companies because you're registered as a for-profit company. You can't just say, like NPR does in the US or ProPublica does, I can't just put a charity button because then I get into all sorts of tax issues as well. But can I flip this around? What do you pay for, Lucy? What content do you pay for?
not much.
And why is that?
For the most part, I get what I need from places like Reuters or Bloomberg, or, I mean, I get a lot of what I need, the content that I need, from the places that just give it to me.
Well, Lucy, weren't you one of the people who said you'd be happy to pay like $25 a month for Maria Popova?
No.
No, that was someone else.
So you have me, like everyone else, my name is Lucy Marcus. You have me confused with someone.
Lucy Scott?
No, I'm not. No.
But to Om's point, though, Lucy,
Yeah.
so just extending that, what might incent you to pay?
I think, I mean, it's hard to say, but I would say that I would pay, I mean, I probably would pay for the New York Times. Things, I mean, well, when we get to my part where I talk about what I think, then I could also talk about sort of the spectrum of different kinds of news, and how, because part of the problem is that we're parsing news so much that you can't get everything from one place anymore. You have to go to a lot of different places. Can I talk about my part yet?
Please.
Is that okay? No?
I want to ask you something about this.
Okay, so I've backed my way into my part, Lucy Marcus, and I actually am sitting here with a couple of hats on. I sit on boards of companies. I sit on the board of Atlantia. I also write a column for Reuters, and I host a TV show for Reuters called In the Boardroom with Lucy Marcus. So my real job is I run businesses and I sit on boards of businesses, so I look at businesses across the board. And of course, Atlantia is a large infrastructure company, the airport and the roadways. I sit on the board of a biotech incubator and investment fund. My background is in structuring and restructuring venture capital funds. But I also have a foot in the world of media. But when I look at media businesses and this question of business models, I look at it from a sort of larger business construct. And there are a couple of things that I find fascinating about where we are in the media business right now, which is if you look at it as compared to other industries, the media business, the newspaper business and so on, was actually a very hidebound, very structured, very old-fashioned business with very little change for many, many years. you had a certain number of channels, and you had a certain way of getting your news, and that was not changing. And now it's been completely disrupted in a number of different ways. You can compare that to something like oil and gas, or mining, or utilities, other areas that we think of as hidebound businesses. And I think one of the things that would be interesting to look at is what are the lessons that we can learn from the way that the media business is all of a sudden, it's as if all the puzzle pieces have been thrown up in the air, and we don't know quite where they're going to land. And there's a lot of experimentation, there's a lot of entrepreneurialism, there are all these different models. And one of the things that I referred to before is, if you look at medicine, you used to have a general practitioner, and then you had a couple of specialists. But over time, people began to specialize more and more and more, to the point that, particularly in the American system actually, that if you were in a car accident, no one person can help you. You need a specialist for your knee, and a specialist for your arm, and a specialist for your tissue, and all kinds of different things. It's something that we see now, the stratification of news, where you have something where you have long reads or very serious pieces by academics, something like Project Syndicate, some of you may know, all the way through to the listicles of BuzzFeed, and you no longer can find everything in one place. And one of the issues is, if I want to look for news, do I have to decide what kind of person I am? Do I have to decide I'm a quantitative person who likes to read only quantitative stuff, and then that's where I go? If I have to choose one thing in the morning, as I'm rushing to get ready, where do I get my news?
Well, obviously the one thing in the morning where you go to get your news is Twitter, right?
Thanks for stealing my punchline.
Sorry.
Shut up. They sat me next to him to keep him. So the thing is that actually what I do is I love Twitter, and I use it a lot. And the first thing I do when I wake up, after saying good morning to my husband, of course, is and my child, is I roll over and I look at Twitter and see what the big news stories are, and I can follow where the links are. And sometimes those are to places that require a paywall, and sometimes it's not. And then the next place I go is if I want hard news and facts, I tend to go to Reuters, and not just out of loyalty to Reuters, love you guys, but also because it's a good place to find global news, and to find Italian news and English news, all kinds of news. By the way, the only reason I'm not speaking in Italian is my Italian is so embarrassing that, well, it's best that I speak in English. But the thing is that I wonder in some ways if the stratification has become so great that we won't at some point again see convergence again. And that's one thing that I think we have to watch for. There are all of these experimentation, there's a lot of money being spent and so on. It's almost like the sort of dot-com bubble. Let's throw things at it, for those of you who are old enough to remember the dot-com bubble. We are. And you might not be. And so I think it's an extraordinary time of experimentation. I was talking to someone from a fairly old-style media group, and they're creating something new where they will unabashedly be chasing the clicks. And I was talking to someone from an old-style media place who said, we are going to stick very close to what we already do, good, long reads, investigative journalism. The problem is, and we'll talk about this a little on a panel that I'm on tomorrow with you, is one of the challenges is how do you do some of the really important investigative journalism that costs money to have one or two people digging through a story for months at a time even to get out what the really important stories are. Can we afford to do that anymore, and does this model support it? The other thing that I think is interesting is the trend of we see content companies, newspaper and media companies trying to do distribution, but then you look at something like LinkedIn, which is a company that is moving towards content distribution, and it meets somewhere in the middle. So, I've been following LinkedIn's progress because I was one of their early influencers, and one of the questions I have in a way is, you get a lot of traffic. I mean, I've had things get 300,000 clicks, and I mean, it's just a lot of. That, to me, at least, that seems like a lot of traffic, because you have a ready-made audience, and then they push the stuff right out to the people already, so they don't have to find the people. The people are there waiting for things, and the question is, is that going to work as well? Can you get this backwards movement backing into a content business, whereas the content businesses are trying to back in to the people business, so we speak. So I think there are a couple of big trends, and but for me, looking at it from a larger perspective, this question of how does this old-time business, this very, I mean, most of us, you know, it was only 5 years ago or something that we saw so much structure in the media business. And so now this is big revolution, and what do we have to learn from that to apply it to other things? Oh, and one last thing I want to talk about is I do believe very strongly that there is an ethical obligation to report the news. I do feel very strongly that the work that journalists do is vital public service. And the only thing that you can compare it to in a way outside of the media business is a public utility which has been privatized. So in a way, if you look at the electric companies or the water companies or any other company where or even you know, public television that has been privatized, you look at that and you realize that this is a public service, and we need it. We need good journalists. We need good investigative journalists. We don't just need listicles and entertainment. But it has to pay for itself. There needs to be a business model that works to support that, and then you will naturally get this friction between you're supposed to supply us with something that's a public good, with how are you going to support yourselves over time? Because, you know, in the UK there's one BBC and we pay the license fee for that, but there are a lot of other choices, and how can they compete with the BBC in order to support themselves? And you get the pushback of paying the same way you get the pushback to public utilities that raise prices, and it's supposed to be a public good that supplies us, and yet the prices are quite high. So that's my...
Well, let's... Go ahead.
I think there is a lot of things Lucy said, and I will make one meta statement on this. I think the biggest flaw in the media industry, the journalism business, is that we are so determined to look at the world from the point of view of publishing and not from the point of view of attention. There is 24 hours in a day, how many times you can slice it, where you can slice it. So wine is in competition with NBC and ABC, and YouTube is in competition with every video provider, including the people who put their video on. So from that standpoint, you know, while you guys were talking, I was playing a game called Monument Valley. That is my attention. That's 8 minutes into that, which I could have been reading an article. So I think we have this really wrong, backward notion of what media looks like in this post, you know, internet, multiple device, multiple screen world. And we have to look at the media and journalism from the standpoint of attention. We have to focus in on that as the core metric of our business, whatever brand we might be. So it is easy for me to...
Someone agrees.
Well,
at least one.
But this is exactly why
The Chartbeat guy agrees.
Right. And like...
But this is what Raju. This is
Right.
why I don't understand what
Time.
Raju was saying about GE making original content, which is awesome, and I'm very happy that GE is making this original content. I don't consider that to be competition with what I do any more than Monument Valley is competition with what I do, or fantasy football is competition, or, you know, the next Spider-Man movie is competition. You know, everything that people spend time doing, you know, if it's going for a walk in the park, it's, you know, in that sense, it's competition with what I do, because it's something which takes up time of the day.
I think it's a very Darwinian world today in terms of attention. So whether, you know, people might want to mock BuzzFeed, but it isn't, because they do get the attention. They do get the people to come to their site and read their stuff. And I think from that standpoint, in this world of, you know, fractionalized attention, there are few things which will actually help you stand out. In a sense, the older brands like the New York Times and Wall Street Journal they have an opportunity to stand out in the crowd. And similarly, you know, Felix, thanks to his colorful blog and shirts, has been able to carve out a little niche for himself, which is the attention people are willing to accord to him. What he does with it is entirely up to him. What these guys do at the Wall Street Journal and Dow Jones with the attention people are giving them is entirely up to them. We took the attention and created our research business. We took the attention and created an events business. I mean, if I was doing, you know, Wall Street Journal, let's say 3 years ago, I would have created an app just for Heard on the Street because it is a product which is more optimized for mobile. It means more current and up-to-date 24/7 information. It would have not costed like $200 or $300 a year subscription. It would have been a $9.95 or $10 subscription per month.
And one of the fallacies of the publishing business is that we have to keep all of the eyeballs
Exactly.
in one thing, and that's the best way to monetize it. So there's been a fear of, this idea of like you'll break apart your product and somehow sell it. But I think that everybody's coming around to it. Before
in the mobile world, I mean, this is like Foursquare's doing it.
Right.
Facebook is doing it. You create a million apps and let 1,000 flowers bloom, and that's better than trying to have one Uber app because.
But it's expensive. I mean, look, again, I'm the business head here, but I've got to say, well, you've got a little bit of business head, but I've got to say everything you do costs money. And if you're sitting in a management position or on the board of one of these things and you have to take a decision about where are we going to put time, resources, money, you've got to make a bet.
I don't think that's true, Lucy. I honestly don't think that
you have to look at the
producing
numbers.
5 apps is cheaper than producing one app which does 5 things. I just don't think that's true anymore.
Yeah, well, it is. It honestly, it's the numbers.
Look at the New York Times is doing it. They're creating an op-ed app. They've got the Scoop app.
Yeah, but it costs money and
Take the
time.
Upshot or take NYT Now. They've added a bunch of people, right? So that's cost.
That's cost. People
so to
cost
assume
money.
that somehow this happens out of the blue is not really.
It's not.
Right.
1,000 flowers don't bloom just from love and water. They also cost money.
The paper doesn't get read in entirety
Absolutely right.
on the mobile. And each mobile, I think people have this mobilized as just one big giant, ball of fur, and it's not. Mobile is essentially defined by the screen. It is, the iPad is different than iPhone, and iPhone is going to be very different than the Nexus 5 and the new phablets, which are 5.5, 5 inch,
right.
because they're all creating a different kind of experience expectation from the audience. So you have to kind of think differently if you're in the business. If you're a big company like the Dow Jones, like the New York Times, like some of the Italian groups, you have to think differently. I think the best media company in my mind right now is the Bertelsmann Group. Nobody talks about them, but they have such a massive traditional TV presence. They have a traditional TV presence in China, places where the old-fashioned media still is a big business. But then they are also going in and doing business with on YouTube and creating fashion channels and food channels out of their stars. But and they've stopped thinking of themselves as being defined by the airwaves. And so I think we have the media, whether it is small guys like us or individual brands like Felix or big companies, we actually have to start thinking in terms of where the audiences are, who are our people, how we relate to them, can we serve their needs, and if yes, what is the best way to serve their needs on what kind of screen they are on.
But you touched on something very briefly that I think is also worth drawing out, which is one of the ways that media companies are making money is through events. And the interesting thing about events is they make money, but they also are dangerous. And the danger of them is that you have this Chinese wall that exists between editorial and sales. And one of the things that we see is it takes the event is supposed to use the brand and to piggyback off of that to make money, because you have to make money to pay for all the apps that Felix wants to build. But the content of that is often not driven as much by the editorial side, but the blowback of having a poor event is difficult on the editorial side. And you and I have talked about this offline a little bit as well, which is, you can have different kinds of conferences, but if the people that are selling the conference aren't actually living with the values of the editorial side, you're going to have a problem. I won't talk about it as much now, but we'll talk about it in a panel after this called Where Are the Women? And one of the issues is, where are the women on the panels of conferences for the FT, the Wall Street Journal, these big, The Economist, the big brands who are supposed to be putting out the best stuff, but we're not seeing representation of these people on events, and then the blowback is not just because of the event, but the blowback goes back to the Wall Street Journal and to the Economist and so on, as actually you're a backwards thinking organization because you're not doing what you need to do. And so the danger of having all of these offshoots, different kinds of apps, and the decentralization, different kinds of conferences, different kinds of this and the other thing, is actually then you can lose control in some way of that. And so how do you monetize all that thing but still stay true to the ethical center of journalism? And then, of course, we saw the Washington Post had a problem because they were offering to have dinners and so on, and special dinners with journalists and so on because they were trying to make money, but that crossed a line. So these businesses are still struggling to make money. How are they going to make money?
I think this is where I completely disagree with people, like whether it's Wall Street Journal or Washington Post. It's not their business. Their business was selling ads. Their business was printing words to sell ads on the paper. That's what they did.
But businesses aren't static.
But like when you do the events business, you need to know, or whatever you do as a company, as a brand, you need to know what you stand for and why you're doing a certain thing, whether it's an event or an app. What is the long-term goal of your potential, money-making opportunity? Clearly, if let's say you are Wall Street Journal, and I'm just going to put words in your mouth because.
Sorry.
So you're next to me. That's the only reason. Your business is to sell as many subscriptions as possible through all these various things. It's not about creating an extra $2 million sales through an event, but it's to get extra 200,000 people to sign up for something. That's the core plan for the paper, or for the research side, you have the fact set and all those kind of things. You have all these products, you need to monetize them effectively, more often, better. What do you do that? So you build tools or events or apps or whatever it is to get people to do those things in order to, as long as we recognize what we really want as a business, it is fairly simple to pursue that strategy and stay pure. I think there is a lot of companies which are getting into the events business without really thinking why they are in the events business, like why they are doing this. None of the people actually ask the question, why do we need to do this?
Well, they're doing because they want to make money.
But there's an even more fundamental problem, right? Because of the traditional way church and state has been managed in our industry for a long time, in most major publishing brands, the brand is default owned by the newsroom. And that causes a very interesting problem when you're trying to take the brand and try to kind of grow it in different ways and stretch it, where the newsroom, which usually has veto powers, tends to kind of say, you can't do that. And that has really restricted a lot of media companies from exploring what the brand can be within the limits of what the brand ought to be. But before we get too carried away, though, because these sessions tend to veer towards pessimism a little bit more than they should be, it's important to remember that journalism or the news business has never had more consumers in the history of the news business since the invention of the Gutenberg press.
That's true.
Right? The Wall Street Journal at its peak, depending on when you think its peak was in print, probably had 2.5 million readers, assuming everybody read every single copy of the paper. Last month, they had 67 million unique readers at WHA Digital Network. Never. New York Times probably has 40 million unique readers online. 1.6 million. So our problem is not that people don't want what you're producing. So it's a good problem to have that we have growing large audiences. The challenge has been to kind of figure out a way to kind of make enough money off them to kind of support the journalism that they come to in the first place.
Yeah. And this is where the events come in, because as you say, we're in a business of giving people experiences, mostly online these days. But if you look at what's happened to the number of events in the world, it's soaring. If you look at what's happened to the music industry, people have never gone to more concerts.
Right.
If there's this weird flip side to the digitization of the world, which is that people actually do feel this need to have human events and human contact and to come together in places like Perugia. This festival was canceled, and then everyone said, no, wait, you can't do that. We have to make this thing happen. And then the sheer force of popular opinion and that, lots of people paid lots of money to make this festival happen because people really like events. People want events. And if that's how people want to spend their time, and if we're in the business of providing products for people to spend their time in, you're going to move into the events business. That's entirely natural brand extension.
Yeah.
It's not wrong.
And I mean, look, again, with the business head on, you've got to make money, and you can't actually put people you can't put organizations in a box and say, you're in the news business, not in the events business. But they also have to realize that if they're going to go into the events business, they have to do it consciously and with a decision. And like any decision, any business decision, because if you go into it, I want to say half-assed, but I probably shouldn't say that, so something else not half-assed. If you go into it in a way that's not wholly committed, then you're going to do it wrong, and then you're going to damage your brand. And so I think you're right that it's about experiences, but that's part of the high expectation. I have a certain expectation if I'm going to go to a Wall Street Journal conference, or if I'm going to go to a New York Times conference or something else, that I'm going to get a certain thing. And if I don't get that, I will be disappointed. But if I do get that, then you win my loyalty that much further. And I think that's part of what's interesting as well about the conferences that aren't broad but actually specific in finance or something else. And so, people will go to breakfast but the other thing is, I think people, just as an aside about the conference business, I think people are moving more and more away from large events to smaller, more intimate. They'll go for a breakfast briefing, or they'll go for something else because they're time poor. So it takes quite a special event like this to actually draw people far away, for 3 days, 4 days at a time. And that, again, is hard for these organizations to achieve. And they're expensive. I mean, these conferences are terribly expensive, which means that by their very nature, you're not going to attract as many people, but that's one way of slicing your audience. I do think that there's one other trend, sort of going back to this business model and this, and this sort of verticalization, which is old things get new names. So now I meet a lot of people who call themselves data journalists or quantitative or whatever, and people who call themselves activism journalists, or and that used to be called journalism based on fact and opinion writers. And to me, I mean, I'm slightly pushing the envelope a little to make it a little controversial, but I do think that that in an effort to be entrepreneurial and find new ways of doing things, and every generation does this, that actually we're in some ways forgetting the fundamental of what the ethic is of why we are in the business of news. And I go back to, there is a greater good to be done by, when Ed Fraser's in the audience and he's from Channel 4 News, when they go to some of the harshest places in the world and they spend the money to invest in going to these places and produce good content that gets out across a vast audience that's on terrestrial TV so people can learn about what's happening in a part of the world. And that is, to me, a worthwhile investment, but it also has to pay for itself.
Lucy, if Emily was here, she would argue that it doesn't have to pay for itself. Because if there's a foundation willing to spend money on The Guardian, and that's nothing wrong with that, that's a model. If Amanda Zamora from ProPublica was up here, she would say our model is there are people willing to fund investigative journalism, and to us that is a business model.
But the money has to come from somewhere.
Sure,
that's
but it doesn't have to be a for-profit approach. It could be, or a city government could say we'll set aside 5% of our budget because we want a robust coverage of the metro area.
I'm agnostic about whether it's for-profit or non-profit, but everything, including multiple apps, needs to pay for itself somehow. And if you can find a benefactor who will pay for it, great. And the only worry, by the way, that I have about a benefactor is the danger that it's not a neutral benefactor who will allow you to go and do what you want. So if you have a benefactor who then says, and again, this is with my corporate governance hat, because my expertise is corporate governance and boards, and one of the things I worry about in nonprofit corporate governance is that oftentimes things can turn into a vanity project, or I'm giving you this money and it's earmarked for this, and if you have a fickle funder or something goes wrong, there's a danger. So in some ways, a commercially driven activity can have the advantage, although then you have a board and the board decides where the money gets spent. Absolutely. I mean, I could go down this road down this rabbit hole. You're right, there are advantages and disadvantages. I don't have a problem with nonprofit or profit. What I do think is good journalism needs to be paid for. I see it as an essential part of the common good.
I'm sending you that Wall Street Journal invoice as soon as you get home.
Okay, good.
Good journalism has to be paid for, right?
Yeah, well, let me go and discuss that. I won't make that joke.
So I'm probably well equipped to answer the question, having started an individual brand-based company, and where we are 12 years later. When I started the business, it wasn't really a business. It was a simple website created with the idea that I needed to write and make complex, in a way which made complex technology simple every day. I used to work for a monthly magazine, a technology magazine which published once a month, which just didn't make any sense to me. And I started doing that. And over a period of time, what I realized that I had, what Kevin Kelly calls 1,000 true fans. And from those 1,000 true fans, we got, 5 to 7 million true fans. And every single step was taken with this idea: we will make complex simple for our community. Did not think even one day if that community was 10 people, 1,000 people, or 1 million people. That has allowed us to think of the whole community as as a complete picture, right? So some people in that community are willing to pay us with their attention and want the content for free, and we'll get 10, 20 cent, $10, $20 CPM against that. There are some people in that community who want to engage with us a little bit higher on a more intimate level. They do that on events. And then there is one part of the community which wants the most premium value add from our way of thinking about the technology world. That is GigaOM research. What next comes next, we don't know, but what we have is a group we cater to. Some people have some money, some people have more money, some people have a lot of money, and that is how the brand or the business of journalism or business of media is going to get monetized. You have to look at it and just say, how do we treat, you have to think of it as, say, Salesforce takes approach of, SaaS business, right? What are people willing to pay for? Why they want to pay for it? But most importantly, you have to be very honest about why you are doing a certain kind of journalism. Because if you don't, then you are all going to be all over the place. And I think this is why companies which have a very high focus are actually going to succeed. I think, I am actually secretly rooting for guys like, Nate Silver and Ezra Klein, because they're trying to do something different. They're trying to invent the old ways of doing things for this new world. And hopefully people might pay for it, and that opens up the minds of other people to try new things. And I think this is where we are at this point. We do not have to think from a pure CPM standpoint. We don't have to think click-throughs and page views.
I'm thinking about aeroplanes here, that you obviously make a lot more money selling business class seats than you do selling economy class seats, but anyone who's ever tried to make a business class airline work has failed. You need the economy class seats to make the business model work. And if you think of the newsroom as an airplane, you have that advertiser-driven product, which can be free, is often free. You have your business class, first class product, which is your own research. Increasingly now we have what I find to be a very interesting and exciting new sort of premium economy model. We have New York Times Premium, we have Slate Plus, where you get the people who've been used to paying a little bit less to pay a little bit more for a little bit extra. And the more different classes of service you can get and the more different amounts of money you can charge, the richer the opportunity space.
There's also one of the areas that publishers have not done well and should do well is there is a privacy data economy that can exist where you can monetize data better, provided you are transparent about how you collect it, what you collect, and how secure it is, and reverse some of these trends in CPMs coming down, because if you know your audience and know them well enough, you are able to kind of monetize them well. And I don't think most publishers have really kind of taken advantage of that in a transparent, clear way. In fact, we've actually given it away to third parties like Outbrain that come and do all sorts of things with our data, rather than kind of preserving the value of that.
Excuse me, I have a question for all of you.
We're so chatty.
All of you. Going back to the basic, I mean, we are talking about business models, about brands, about events, and so on. But I want to talk about journalism. There is this very large proliferation of devices. I mean, we have from the smartphone to the tablet to the PCs, and I think that in the next years we will see a lot of different things. I don't know why, which ones, but do you think that we need to think as publisher, as journalists, of different forms of journalism for each kind of device or not? Or the journalism is really one and we just need to use different devices for the same content or not?
So I think that the days of thinking unique content alone is going to allow you to compete and win. I think those days are over because the advantage you have with unique content is now reduced to seconds. Because you put something out, and within seconds a Business Insider or somebody will have something, and then there are streams of people going away into those brands or those platforms. But what is still very much preservable and can be a competitive advantage is if you shift from creating only content to creating interesting experiences with that content. Because experiences, which is how you consume somebody's content, can still be very unique and proprietary. So if a newsroom can say, I have a great piece of journalism, but how is it consumed and can I make it interesting and different and bring that together with your technologists and developers into a compelling experience, even if 5 other people write about the same story, the experience is good enough that you will retain your audience and engagement. So I think that pivot has to happen.
You can't reblog Snowfall. Like that, you know, the reason it got so many views is because you had to go there to experience it. And that's what I'm doing at Fusion as well, is I want to create things which can be experienced on your phone really immersively and which are very hard to replicate. And yes, I think if you try to do a sort of write once, consume anywhere, one-size-fits-all thing, that's not going to work. That's what Raju was saying about why he needs many more than 10 people at the Wall Street Journal working on mobile, because you do need to think about the different channels very seriously and the way that people consume in those channels. If you look at newspapers, there's this amazing infrastructure of headline, of typesetters and designers, and every single page is laid out very carefully, and people are optimizing for the medium on a certain size of paper, and making that newspaper the perfect vehicle for what it's expressing. And then you throw everything up on the website and everything has the same story template and everything looks exactly the same. You don't have different size headlines, it's harder to navigate, and it doesn't work as well because you're trying to take content which is written for one medium and put it on another. And if you really optimize for different devices and different channels, then you can have much more success.
I guess I look at it quite simply because I have 2 thoughts on it. One is, again, with a business head-on, I think you have to meet people where they are, and you need to be able to serve the needs of people to be able to consume your content. And I also think that we now have more ways of creating content that's more interesting. So I think there's a place for something like Reuters as a news service, where I go to get my news. And then there's something else, which is when I write my column, as often as possible, we also do a video about it. So I'll do the show that I do, and we'll have a conversation about the content of the column, and we'll expand on that and so on. So, and then some people will watch the video, and some people will read the column, and they'll share one or the other. And the platform needs to be agnostic in terms of how you can view it, because you can't always view something on Reuters.com on your mobile. You need to be able to go to YouTube or something. So that's one thought. The other thing that my producer, Amy, is in the audience, me, and we were talking this morning about a piece that I did when I went to the Ambrosetti Forum in September.
Okay.
And yeah, in Chernobyl. And I went armed with this and a plug-in microphone. And I went as a participant, but also with a journalism hat on. And what I did was I had a couple of questions that I wanted to ask people, and I grabbed people in the break and so on, places where the media weren't really allowed, and I said, in 30 seconds or less, can you tell me the answer to this question? And I filmed a whole series of those on my phone, and I uploaded them back to London to Amy, and Amy put it together into a fantastic sort of collage and snippets of some of the most interesting and knowledgeable people in the world commenting on something which I never could have gotten if I had said, hey, can you come over to this film crew over here? I just need 5 minutes of your time. I could never have dragged them away from their coffee. It just wouldn't have been possible. And then the other film that we put together was, I did Instagram, I tweeted, I took film, I did Instagram films, I did all kinds of stuff, and then we put all those different media into a film. And that went out as well. So you could see the tweets, the comments, the people, and I did an In the Boardroom with Lucy Marcus session, and we did a little bit of that. So using and all I went with, I'm telling you right now, was this 2-year-old phone and a plug-in mic. And with all of that, I mean, you need a really good producer behind you to actually, an editor, to pull all that stuff together. But that's all it takes. That and a brain is helpful, and some hair and ears and a mouth. But that's completely changed the nature of things, because all of a sudden you got a back-end view, a participant's view, and access that we couldn't have gotten if I had a lot of equipment or was very demanding or had to sit down and write a lot or any of that stuff. And that, as I understand it, got a lot of hits and a lot of interest and a lot of shares. And I think we need to think creatively like that about how we use that information, and also then how people can view it, and meeting people where they are, not what we want, but what they want. And the difficulty, of course, is predicting what they want.
I have for you, Hom. You started with your site about 15 years ago, something like this. Right. Well, and
give or take a year.
how many of the things that you thought you understood many years ago were now are reality? I mean, when you look back, what do you think of today? You think that many things happen exactly what you thought or not? Because your position is very, very important is a point of view that's very interesting for us.
So I started writing on the internet in '95, and I was completely immersed in the idea of the internet, and the marriage of internet publishing platform with technology industry made perfect sense to me. It meant that an industry which changed so often should only publish on the internet. That was a very early assumption in '95. I went to work at Forbes.com, and where I learned that is actually the case. And there was a lot of assumptions which I had in my head, which I learned at Forbes, which was like you have to publish multiple times a day, you have to have many variations of the length, depending on what kind of readers might be coming to all those things which I had in my head, we got to experiment at Forbes. I'm talking about '97 till 2000 time frame, when I went to work for the magazines. And in 2000, when I actually took to active blogging, it became pretty obvious that this is the way the world is going to be. If we are going to be constantly connected, the news business, the idea of sharing news and information is going to move at the network speed. What I had never assumed, that the network speed would become so fast,
Yes.
that you would actually have to get off the network. The stream was the future, but the stream started moving so fast that I decided, it was very clear that we were moving really, really fast. And I think a lot of that was because nobody could predict the emergence of Facebook and Twitter as the boosters for media. They came as social networks, but they became the boosting mechanism for media and attention. And that part is something which has happened in 2012 and onwards. That is something brand new, and we have the flywheel is spinning so much faster, which is why you're seeing a whole bunch of new publications which are coming out. So the transition to the broadband and the always-on networks was pretty obvious in 2000, which is why I was dead set to doing this. Last 2 years have been a bit of a surprise, but how quickly things have changed in last 2 years. And I think in next 5 years, they will change even more, because
fast.
there is more, like the world is, the internet as we know it is basically at an end right now. There is a Chinese internet, there is a Russian internet, there is the Brazilian internet. These are exploding at their own, they have their own escape velocity, they have their own social networks, they have their own, they are creating their own stars and their own media. And I think we had this very English language view of the media world, and that is changing. And next 2 years or 3 years, you're going to see a big change because of that. So, it is definitely, so last 20 odd years have been very interesting, and things have worked out according to plan. Next 5 years, all bets are off.
I think the other big difference also is user-generated content, because the barriers to entry in order to produce things by people, just everybody, has changed significantly as well. And that also means that the downside of that, not to stay so pessimistic, but the downside of that is that it's hard to tell sometimes who's a journalist and who's a man on the street. And in some ways, this was Storyful is a good place for that. There you go, nice softball. But the other thing is that means that the value of journalism is also in expertise. And the value of journalism is actually not just sharing a thought or an idea, but also what else you can bring to that. And that's what people will pay for as well, is expertise and understanding, and not necessarily what's called activism journalist, which is different, but maybe opinion, but also infused with knowledge and going deep, and what's expensive. I mean, that's expensive. So that's kind of stuff that Channel 4 does is expensive, to send people out and go deep and embed and all of that stuff. And that's what's costly. And that's, again, brings us back to this conundrum of there are some organizations that are actually depending more and more on user-generated content, but what you lose is the authentication of that, the Storyful side of things, and also what you lose is the expertise infused. The other thing we've lost, by the way, just a pet peeve of mine, is we've lost copy editors. Oh, I miss you, copy editors. So, and that actually, but all of these things cost money.
I mean, as an industry, we have to move from our traditional idea of gatekeepers to essentially become gate openers. The brand is still valuable, but we have to point people to kind of within all the flow of information. The reason they come to us is because they trust us, but that's no longer about our own content. It's about pointing them to the right places.
I think this is what the point is. As the stream becomes faster and faster, the brand starts to emerge as the place which adds credibility to what is out there. So when Felix sends me to a link on his Twitter account, I am more likely to link than from Reuters, mostly because Reuters has an agenda to push their content, whereas Felix could be sharing an article from even somebody he disagrees with, but he thinks it's important to be shared. And I think the point which is like on the expertise thing.
But how do you monetize that?
I don't think it's about monetizing that just one thing. That monetization is part of the whole scheme. Is like, what is the value of the overall brand? What is the value of Felix Salmon experience? That experience is going to lead to what people will pay for, right? You have to be constantly saying, this is who I am. Like George Clooney is George Clooney all the time. Not just in one movie, not just in the tabloids. He is George Clooney, and you're not George Clooney. Just okay? But
Felix, you heard it here first.
But you never see any dilution in the George Clooney experience anywhere. And I think that we as media, the journalism professionals, have to start thinking like that. What do we believe in? What do we stand for? Where do we come? Why are we doing these things? We have to answer that question before we start monetizing things. If we don't have an honest relationship with our community, we will never be able to make money off it. And the point of expertise, I am succeeding because of a lot of my editors who spent a lot of time on me. There was a big company which spent a lot of time on me. And I think this is where folks like you have a huge advantage, where you can actually help create experts within your group. And if you could figure out a way for them to stay and not pull like a Nate Silver or Ezra Klein, there is actually a huge opportunity for brands with deep pockets.
Yes.
Well, the touch
Well,
is actually just
think
a
there-
last a teeny
Let's
weeny
finish
thought, which
that,
is
let's finish
sorry,
that.
it's a teeny weeny thought, which is it touches on something else, which is the distinction between Felix Salmon and Reuters, right? So if you've got the brand of the company, and then you have much more than ever before the brand of the individual, and that means that if Felix goes somewhere else, or I go somewhere else, I take my people with me because they trust me versus the larger brand, or not versus, but in addition or supplementary to. So it's just another.
Thank you very much. We need to stop right now because we are late. Good luck to Felix.
George. May I call you George?
And thank you. And
Thank you.
I hope you like this time.